In the novel Ordinary Time, faith is defined as the grace to walk in darkness as though it were light, to doubt and keep on walking. Am I going to be looking at your pretty face the whole time, or?
I am trying to spotlight you right now, but I'm
Oh.
on a different device today, which means I have to make sure that, there we go, spotlight video. There you go.
There it is.
Now you can see you.
We're looking at my
Yes.
pretty face.
Yep. You get Braskin.
In the novel Ordinary Time, faith is defined as the grace to walk in darkness as though it were light, to doubt and keep on walking. But is that faith or foolishness? Some would ask sincerely. To keep on keeping on when there is little or no compelling evidence to bolster your convictions. Faith or foolishness? We cannot finally answer that critical question on the basis of anyone else's experience than our own, but our experiences are often informed and shaped by the experiences of others. And so we come today to the first of several considerations of Abraham. One, as good as dead, is the way the New Testament describes him. Yet from across the millennia, his vibrant testimony can still be heard, that God is as good as his word, that God's promises never fail. Toward the end of the 11th chapter and the beginning of the 12th, there is a major transition in the text of Genesis as we move from primeval history and a type of literature which some call myth to what scholars call legend. Although the stories which follow are largely believable, there is no independent historical documentation that there ever was an Abraham or an Isaac or a Jacob or a Joseph. Yet both Israel and the church trace their origins to the exploits of these ancestors in the faith. In these wonderful stories, however, the issue is never their historical accuracy, but rather their theological veracity. Not was there, in fact, a Mr. Abraham and a Mrs. Sarah who did precisely this or that, but rather through their experiences, what do we learn about God? And here is the first thing we learn about God, that God controls history. The account of the Tower of Babel is the climax of primeval history. The story illustrates the ultimate act of rebellion, the total denial of God in the absolute assumption of self-sufficiency. For those who understand themselves to be completely self-reliant, God is at best irrelevant. And yet it is precisely at this point of humankind's ultimate and complete estrangement from God that another and quite unexpected story begins. The incomparable story of God's initiative to bridge the chasm and bring about reconciliation, an act completed on Golgotha and confirmed in the dim first light of Easter Day. From the cacophony of Babel, the welter of disparate people and incomprehensible languages, a clear and unmistakable voice was heard by one man. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I, 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 I. Count them. 5 times in 3 sentences, the first person singular appears. And what does that tell us? But that history is held securely in God's hands and not ours. That the future comes to us solely as a gift. Now that is a strong word, gift. Perhaps even a hard and disagreeable word to those who fancy that they can manage the future, their own and the world's. But the very first thing we discover in Abraham's experience is that there is no future save for those who accept it from the hand of God. Before it is Abraham's, the story is God's. A God who is willing to begin again, who is determined to make all things new. The same voice which called creation into being now makes a second call to an otherwise utterly undistinguished nomadic Semite, through whom God intends to fashion an alternative community of faithfulness and obedience in the midst of a creation gone awry. And through that family, as flawed and imperfect as any family you can imagine, every family on this earth throughout the whole of history, right down to your family and mine, will be blessed. Why Abraham? Well, who can say? There is not a shred of evidence to support the selection. It is almost as if God would find it more entertaining to make the fulfillment of his promises as difficult as possible. Think about it. 100-year-old man married to an aged, barren wife. From such a pair as that would come a great nation, through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. God controls the future, without a doubt. But he always leaves room for human freedom. Abraham had a choice. Make no mistake of that. Whatever he heard and supposed to be coming from God could just as easily have been put down as indigestion, taken care of in no time at all by munching a couple of Tums. But this is what we read instead. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him. One simply cannot overemphasize the significance of that sentence in the history of salvation. In those 9 words, you will find the origin of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him. Went from his country, his clan, and his home. That is simply unimaginable. Granted, they were nomads already, but only within the confines of an established territory. And when they did move, the whole clan came along. So for an old man with a barren wife to leave that security for a foreign land, trusting in promises, the fulfillment of which all turned on an heir, why, such a thing is absurd, an absurdity called faith. But without a recorded utterance of any sort, no questions, protests, attempts to negotiate terms, or secure guarantees. Abraham went, believing the promise without any visible evidence is what is meant by faith. That's the way someone summed it up. But before you dismiss Abraham as utterly unbelievable, and therefore of no help or consequence to you in your own spiritual pilgrimage, I assure you that we will discover much more about him as the remainder of the story unfolds. Later on, he lies to save his own skin. He presumes to instruct God in matters of justice and equity, and in an effort to help God out, who would appear to be incapable of fulfilling his promises, Abraham consorts with Sarah's maid and then treats her shabbily. The man was human enough, make no mistake of that, but he remains to this day synonymous with faith, because when God said go, he went, as the Lord had told him. In his going, it is appropriate to emphasize the abandonment of all human security, country, clan, and home, but by far the greater act of faith was to trust the promises of God, given the reality of Sarah's barrenness. A woman's worth in that society was measured by the number of children she bore, and more particularly, the number of sons. She could imagine nothing worse than to be barren, and there was no greater embarrassment for her husband. Abraham may have loved Sarah, and presumably he did, but until she bore a son, in her own eyes, she was an utter failure. In his call to Abraham, God was promising a future to one who, by definition, had no future. Yet Abraham went. But there is more. The barrenness of Sarah is a powerful metaphor describing any one of countless circumstances which would seem to foreclose our own futures. Unemployment at a time when you're too old and too qualified to get another job. From creative productivity one day to watching soap operas the next. That is barrenness. The failure of financial institutions in which your future is literally invested. That is barrenness. Choice after irresponsible choice, which little by little uses up your virtue until that moment of wrenching honesty comes and you must declare moral bankruptcy. That is barrenness. Domestic abuse is barrenness. Addiction is barrenness. Public housing projects are barrenness. Not beautiful is barrenness, according to Naomi Wolf in The Beauty Myth. Not thin is barrenness, say the airlines. Barrenness is the way of human history, Walter Brueggemann contends. It is an effective metaphor for hopelessness. There is no foreseeable future. There is no human power to invent a future. But the marvel of biblical faith is that barrenness is the arena of God's life-giving action. There is the gospel in this ancient story of heartache and the deep frustrations of aspirations unfulfilled. Could it be then that nothing less than barrenness forces us to face the fact that Any future of our own devising is automatically foreclosed because the future, yours and mine, belongs to God alone, and that future is not foreclosed only for those who are willing to entrust their futures to the providence of God. To Brueggemann again, the story of Abraham and Sarah is not in the first instance their story or even Israel's story, but the story of a God who wills to begin again, to create newness in history precisely out of despair. It is the story of grace, demonstrating again and again the power of God to make life over by his inexplicable but relentless transforming power. This is the Apostle Paul's summation. Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb, being fully convinced that God was able to do what God promised. So they set out, this odd couple, whose very circumstances epitomized the complete absence of any human potential, any historical possibility. Their journey itself, a metaphor of that spiritual pilgrimage which is still the life of faith. It is a radical metaphor, no less demanding and difficult than faith itself, for it calls us who yearn for settlement, security, and placement to abandon, renounce, and relinquish, to sit loose to everything by which the world seeks to define us and by which we estimate our own worth: money, title, education, genealogy, power, recognition. Such a renunciation is exceedingly difficult to speak of in our culture, which focuses on self-indulgence, because you owe yourself this. You've earned it. This is what you deserve. You only go around once, you know. And because of our penchant for instant gratification, someone described it as a one-generational ideology. But we, no less than Abraham and Sarah, are called to journey toward a promised future that will never fully come in our own lifetimes. They died in faith without having received the promises, the writer to the Hebrews observed, but from a distance they saw and greeted those promises. And he went on, if they had been thinking of the land they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. Their journey demonstrates that the only way out of barrenness is the willingness to abandon, renounce, and relinquish those securities which define us and bind us, that to stay in safety is to remain barren, that to live in risk is to have hope. Is it any wonder then that the earliest Christians were known as the followers of the way, people whose journey calls into question every form of life that settles for barrenness? Listen to this. A scribe approached Jesus and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then someone else said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. As Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon and Andrew, casting their nets into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, go and sell what you own and give the money to the poor. Then come follow me. No less than they and countless others before them, you and I are called to abandon, renounce, and relinquish everything by which the world seeks to define us and by which we estimate our own worth. And to say with the psalmist, I trust in thee, O Lord, thou art my God, my times are in thy hand. And the promise to those who dare to do that is that they will be led no less certainly than Abraham and Sarah were to that peace, which only comes with the conviction that you are in the place where God wants you to be, and that you are doing the thing for which God created you. What a difference it makes. That is the affirmation which Peter Marshall, remember him, once made to his congregation at New York Avenue. And then he went on to say this, but if you want to hear God, you will have to face up squarely to the question, am I willing to follow his plan wherever it may lead and to do whatever he tells me? This is a decision that must be resolved before you can receive any guidance from God, before your Christian adventure can even begin. And it is just at this point that many of us are in the grip of a terrible conflict. We want to hear God speaking to us, but are afraid of what we might hear. We want to be made clean, but there is still a hunger for the husks the swine eat. We would follow Christ, but we don't want our friends to think we are odd. We want God's way, but also our own. That sounds familiar enough to me, doesn't it to you? And the only resolution of that dilemma is to tell Christ about it, Marshall urged. Offer him your divided self and competing loyalties as perhaps the only honest gift we have to offer. Ask Christ to take over and make it whole, and he will. Not without cost, however. Habits will surely have to be broken, attitudes be revised, behavior be modified. Certain associations may even have to be abandoned, but with your willingness to do what you must, the assurance is that there will become available to you, the only power capable of defeating temptation and making you joyous and free at last from everything by which the world seeks to define you and by which so mistakenly you calculate your own worth. And then, as Marshall summed it up, though you may not know what will be your harbor, you will know your pilot, and all will be well. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed, God promised Abraham. Paul called that promise the gospel beforehand, that from the bleakest barrenness, indeed from one as good as dead, comes the proof that God is as good as his word, that God's promises never, never fail. So Abraham went. It can't be simpler than that. What do you think?
So I'm struck, Jack, by we are where God wants us to be. And we want to hear, but we don't listen. We all want to go to heaven, but we don't want to die. So I think it was a song that said that.
Well, I can understand that, can't you?
Yeah, it's so very real. But I think we, maybe I, maybe just me, struggles with, I'm trying to listen, but I still don't hear. And particularly in our culture today, this, we hear we're supposed to love, but we see such division in our society. So how do you listen? How do you participate in a way that is one, functional, and two, or one, godly, and two, functional? So what this brings to my mind is we're all kind of like Abraham. We're struggling with our faith and how to apply it to our lives.
Sometimes I yearn for the clarity which these biblical figures seem to have evidenced. I do not believe that they heard voices any more than we do. It would scare me half to death if I did. But increasingly, I become impressed with the way God can move in my life in very undramatic, but in retrospect, clearly influential ways. It's more hindsight with me than being clear contemporaneously. But I can look back and say, wow, there's no way that could have happened unless God was involved in my life.
I would argue too that reading stories like this and kind of thinking about them in your current moment can really help reframe a current experience too. I've often found that looking at a story in a certain way can really help me re-envision what I'm going through or kind of reset my head about what it means to be in the moment I'm in at that very moment. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I can see exactly what God's up to, but it can help me see a purpose or a path.
And I find it very exciting and comforting to be convinced that I do see that and assume with conviction that it's God's doing. But yeah, I think these stories are not for anything other than just at some point to see ourselves in them.
I mean, there's a reason why these stories have endured for thousands of years. They continue to have meaning for the people who read them and who share them. I mean, they continue to have value.
Well, and in Abraham's case, to be the founding patriarch of 3 of the world's great religions.
Yeah. It encourages me too that he's not perfect. I mean, I assume you're going to get into his cycle more, but you know, he listens and responds at that moment, but he also makes some pretty big gaffes down the line and has to you know, think through the consequences of certain decisions that he makes out of fear.
He would not be nearly as useful to me if he were perfect.
For sure.
And this is part of my disappointment with the author of Job. I wish that he had not, you know, gotten it all back at the end, that he just was like the rest of us. He got dumped on and stayed dumped on. But no, we're going to have great fun with Abraham's bed hopping and lying about Sarah and whether once or twice. And the first sermon I ever preached on Abraham, I titled Faith, 2 White Lies, and a Good Laugh. The faith being obvious, the 2 white lies we will discover. He said Sarah was not his wife, but his sister. Well, she was his half-sister, as it turns out. And a good laugh, we'll discover, which is what Sarah did when somebody told her that she would get pregnant at the age of 90. She had a good belly laugh. And that's fun too, part of the story.
Yeah.
I want you to be aware of the fact that Abraham also plays a significant role in the New Testament. We don't just leave him behind at the end of Genesis. And so let me talk to you just a few minutes about where Abraham appears in the New Testament. It bears repeating, I think, that Genesis 12 through 50 is called legend rather than history, because there are no non-canonical, which is to say non-biblical references to any of the goings-on recounted in those chapters. Scholars speculate, and on what basis, I have no earthly idea, that the story of Abraham took place in the 2100 to 2000 BC period. Now, we will continue to talk about the life and times of Abraham and his family during the next 2 or 3 weeks, but he was also a significant figure in the New Testament, and he first appears in the genealogies of Jesus. Abraham's name leads off the 2nd verse of the 1st chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Those of us who grew up with the King James Version and all those begats tend to ignore those genealogies, but they are really more than some tedious and unnecessary introduction to the New Testament. A close study of them reveals some fascinating information. For example, Matthew's genealogy includes 4 women. Now, that in itself is surprise enough, but the surprise is even greater when you consider the 4 women named. First is Tamar, a clever woman who seduced her father-in-law with very interesting results that you can read about in the 38th chapter of Genesis. Then comes Rahab, madam of the best little house of ill repute in Jericho. Next came the saintly Ruth, or saintly we thought, but you need to examine closely the nuanced shenanigans which took place with Boaz there on the threshing room floor in the dark of night. Shenanigans contrived by Naomi. And then Bathsheba, more sinned against than sinner, of course. However, her conniving to make certain that Solomon succeeded David bears consideration. Luke's genealogy appears in the 3rd chapter and is not nearly as interesting, I think, although it works just the opposite way. It begins with Jesus and works backward all the way through Abraham to Adam. In the Gospels, we find Abraham, along with Isaac and Jacob and the prophets, happily ensconced in heaven, an interesting place to find them. One of the more memorable references is to be found in Luke 16, the wonderful story of Dives, the rich man, and Lazarus, the poor beggar, hungry and full of sores, who lay each day at the gate of Dives' mansion. Both died, you remember, and we find Lazarus carried away by angels to be with Abraham, while Dives is in hell, begging Abraham to send Lazarus to him with a drink of water. Abraham refuses. Then Dives begs Abraham to convince his brothers of the fate that awaits them, that surely the ghost of Lazarus will get their attention. But Abraham says, the brothers have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. In Acts 7, before he was martyred, Stephen recounts the history of Israel, beginning with God's call to Abraham. The religious authorities were not persuaded and set about stoning him to death. The most thorough treatment of Abraham occurs in chapter 4 of Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul attempts to sort out the relationship of faith and the law. Now, this is heavy going, and without a good commentary, I would have struggled to understand Paul's argument. It is, to use a wonderful word, turgid. Here's the gist of it. Abraham was faithful to God before the law was given. Now, by the law, Paul means not only the 10 Commandments, but the countless, indeed hundreds of laws which spun out of those commandments, ceremonial, culinary, and legal. So Paul says, salvation comes not by keeping the law, but rather by faith. Repeatedly, Paul observes that Abraham was deemed to be righteous, that is to say, in a right relationship with God, based on nothing he did. Even before his faith was tested in the near sacrifice of Isaac, and before Abraham submitted to circumcision as a sign of the covenant with God, Abraham trusted God and was faithful. And this is fundamental to Paul's argument. Throughout his writings, that one cannot earn salvation by keeping the law. Hear Paul Ochtemeier in his commentary on Romans. He said the problem with the law, in Paul's view, does not rest with the law, but with sin and what sin does through the law, namely, sin uses the law to make us think we do not need to rely on mercy, but can somehow make it under our own power. To want to depend on works of the law means to want to depend on ourselves rather than on God. Put another way, the problem with the law is the problem of our unwillingness to receive the generosity of God. The third chapter of Galatians returns to this law vis-a-vis faith discussion, which you find in Romans 4, but Hebrews 11 is probably the New Testament reference concerning Abraham, which we know best. And let me read a little of that to you. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, he received power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And finally, Abraham appears again in James, the second chapter, the section of that letter which the author argues the relationship between faith and works. So the Abraham story is not merely a good yarn. It shapes Israel's self-understanding and plays a significant role in the Christian's understanding of what brings about a right relationship with God.